Today we're going to learn how to create this really awesome clay chameleon. What we need to start with first is the base. Sculptures often have a base, and a base is kind of like the foot for a sculpture. It's what the sculpture stands on. So to create our base, we're going to make our base look like a leaf for our chameleon. So to start, you'll have a large piece of clay and a leaf template. What you'll need to do is take your clay and flatten it. When you're flattening your clay, you're going to flatten it by pounding. As you're pounding, your clay needs to be as thick as an Oreo cookie. So I'm going to thump it down on my mat and pound it flat. Now that I have my clay flattened, I'm going to make sure that it's about the right size. If little parts are hanging off, it's okay. Maybe I could change the direction of my template or just not trace every part of it. I do want to use the smoother side of my clay, so I'm now going to just peel this off of my mat, flip it over to the smooth side, and I'm going to set my template on there where most of it fits. If a little bit is hanging off, like the stem, it's okay. And now I'm going to cut. When I cut, I'm cutting all the way through the clay, which means my stick will be scraping along the bottom of the mat. To make sure that I've got my stick in the right place, I'm going to go ahead and push into the clay, and my stick should be perfectly vertical. That tells me that it's going all the way through to the mat. It always helps when you're cutting out clay to pull your stick toward you and to always rotate your mat so that you can keep pulling your stick toward you. It's very difficult to cut your clay when you're pushing your stick away. You're needing to cut all the way through the clay, so every now and then just make sure that when you pull this away, you haven't only cut half the way through, but that you've cut completely through your clay. Save all of this extra clay. Go ahead and put it over to the side because you'll be needing it next up for the parts of your chameleon. I'm just going to go ahead and continue cutting out my leaf shape. Now that I'm finished cutting out my leaf shape, I'm going to go ahead and add some lines for the veins of my leaf. I'm going to peel this off, but before I even do that, I'm going to take care of some of these edges because clay, even though it's very soft right now since it's made out of water and dirt, when the water evaporates and the clay is fired in the kiln, any of those edges that are a little bit pointy right now, which are soft, when it comes out of the kiln, they can be very sharp. So you need to make sure you take a finger with a little bit of slip. Slip is water and clay mixed together. It's a very watery clay. We can use it when the clay gets dry. We can also use it when we're attaching pieces of clay. I'm not smushing the clay down flat. I'm just taking care of where the top and the side come together and create a point. I'm rounding that point. Now that I've got that finished, I'm going to go ahead and add the veins of my leaf. Now usually there's a large vein right down the middle of the leaf, which I'm going to draw. This time when I'm using my stick, I don't want to go all the way through the clay. And so when I use my stick, I'm not going to push it all the way through and make my stick vertical. I'm actually going to have my stick be more of a diagonal, like this. So notice that my hand is tilting it at a diagonal line, and I'm dragging it through the clay. This time I'm pushing away. The reason I'm pushing away is because it makes my line nice and smooth. If I start pulling my stick back towards me, it creates a little bit of what I call clay boogers, which don't look so nice. Now that I've got that one big vein, you all know from looking at leaves that there's other lines that come away and they go all the way to the edge of the leaf. And I'm just going to any of those parts that curve outward. So I'm starting at the big line and going to any parts that curve outward, all the way to the edge, not cutting through my clay. And now I'll do even smaller ones. It's almost like the veins of a leaf look like a tree. So it's like I'm now making the smaller branches. So I'm going to make some on either side of those lines that I just drew. Now let's talk about how to make the chameleon himself or herself. We're going to start with this part of the body, from the head to the tail. We will then be adding the legs and the head. So right now we're starting with this portion. And if you look at it, you can see that this is like a long tube shape. We call that a coil. And I don't know if you can tell, but it also goes from being a very thick coil all the way down to a very thin one. So that's what we are trying to accomplish with this next step. You'll have a piece of clay about this size, the size of a small orange, and I'm just going to roll it into a ball the best I can. It doesn't have to be smooth or perfect. And once you've got that done, you're going to need to roll it into a coil. A coil is like a clay snake. And when you roll a coil, you can either start with your hands or you can do it on your mat. So I'm going to go ahead and start mine a little bit with my hands. Notice I changed the direction. Instead of making circles, I'm now going up and down my hands. And now that I've got it kind of a coil shape, I'll get it a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and put it on my mat. Now my goal is to make it go from very thick to thin. So to do that, I'm only going to roll on one end of my coil, like this. My hand is actually a little bit tilted or angled so that I'm creating this. Sometimes when I'm rolling a coil though, it will do this, where it just thumps back and forth. If that happens to you and you end up with something that looks a little bit shaped like that, what that means is you're not rolling all the way up and all the way back far enough. You can roll it back into a ball and try it again. What I'm going to do is just shape it with my hands, reshape it so the whole thing is more round, and then I'll try it again. All the way up and all the way back. So it kind of looks a little bit like a microphone. If your clay gets a little bit dry, you can add a little bit of water to any parts of those cracks. If your clay happens to break as you're doing this, if it breaks apart like that, that's not a problem either, because all you have to do is just overlap the two pieces of clay that broke and try again. So I'm just going to roll it all the way up and all the way back. Notice I'm rolling pretty slowly because this guy up here is thumping. We don't want him to break apart. There we go. All right, now I'm going to take a finger because I see some spaces where it's cracking a little bit, and I'm just going to gently massage some of that slip into the clay. Now that I have that done, I'm going to start with the tail. And the chameleon has a really distinct tail that's curved in like a spiral. So I'm just going to take my fingers and start rolling this in, and I'm doing it slowly. And if I see cracks as I go, just rub a little bit of water into it. I don't want to ignore those cracks because it could cause a break in the clay. So depending on how much of a coil you want, that's about how far you want it to go. And I see some cracks there. Piece of cake. That was so easy. Now, what I'm going to do is make sure that it can stand up on its own a little bit and just flatten the bottom where I'll be putting the feet. Any places where it's not smooth, I'm going to take a moment and take care of that. Now, that's the body. Easy. Let's talk about how to work on those legs. So I'm going to set this aside. Looks a little bit like a whale or kind of a crazy snail. Set that over there. Make sure it can stand on its own. And let's talk about legs. Your chameleon has 4 legs. So you'll have a piece of clay. I don't know how much exactly I'm going to need yet. So we're going to find out as we're working. So I'm going to take my clay. I'm just going to break it in half. So I've got 2 pieces that are kind of equal, and I'll break those 2 in half. These are going to be for my legs. Now that I've got those 4 pieces, I'm going to go ahead and roll them into a ball. And each of my balls or spheres of clay should be about the same size. So if you have one that's a lot bigger than another one, you could always take from the bigger piece and give to the smaller piece. Now that I have my 4 pieces rolled, I'm going to roll them just a little bit up and down my hands to create kind of a short, squatty coil. I don't want my legs of my chameleon to be too long because then they won't be thick enough to hold my chameleon up. So I'm going to take this piece, roll it up and down just a little bit. So you see that your legs are going to be pretty short. Up and down just a little bit, and I'm going to put them all in a row just to make sure that they're about the same height. If you make it too long, you see that that would be way too long. It just wouldn't be strong enough to hold up your chameleon. So you want to make them kind of short and squatty. All right, now that I've got my 4 legs, they look like they're about even. This one's the smallest, so I'm going to make it a little longer. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach those to the bottom of my chameleon. So To attach, you know that I'm going to have 2 in the front and 2 in the back. So I'm going to flip this guy over. Whenever you're attaching clay, you have to use a toothbrush. That's going to create scratching lines into your clay. That's called scoring. And we're also using that watery clay called slip. It's going to act as glue. So I'm getting it really scratchy and really full of that clay glue. Now I'm going to go ahead and start putting these on here. Now the problem is if I just stick it like that, when that clay glue dries, it's going to fall off. So right now I'm just going to set it on there to see if it will work. But if I really want to stay, notice I'm twisting it like a knob of a radio and I'm smashing it in there a little bit so the legs are going to get a little bit shorter, and that's good. That's okay. So don't just set it on there. Make sure you put it on there, twist and push, trying not to lose the shape of your legs. I know I've got 2 in the back. Twist and push. One more right here. Now, the true test is to see if it can stand. And if it can stand up on its own, you know that your legs are going to work. So what I need to do next is really make sure they're attached by smoothing this leg into the body. Do you see how there's a line right there where you can see the 2 are connected? We want that line to disappear. So I'm just using my finger. If you want to get your finger wet to help you smooth it. If you don't like the feeling of clay getting under your nail, I know I don't. Sometimes I use the back of my thumbnail to smooth the clay. And that'll keep clay from getting under your nail and also does a really good job of smoothing the clay together. And to make those lines go away, just take your finger. If you want to get your finger wet, you can do that too. Flip it around, do the exact same thing on this side. There should not be that line right there. This will help make sure the legs are nice and attached. Let's see if it still stands. And you know what? If it doesn't stand anymore, if it falls over, you just take the legs off, try it again. Maybe you made the legs too long. Maybe you didn't have enough clay. The great thing about clay is that you can always roll the clay back up and try it again. All right, so now I've got my chameleon, and I'm just going to make his legs spread out a little bit because he's looking a little tall. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is add a texture. Chameleons have a great texture, a scaly reptilian texture all over their body. And to do that, I'm going to use the back of my stick, the dull side, and I'm just going to press at a diagonal. I'm not stabbing all the way through. I'm just creating a texture, and I'm just pressing at a diagonal to make a really great scaly line. Now that I have a great reptilian body with an awesome texture, and I did the entire front, top, and sides just using the back of my stick, now I need to work on the head of my chameleon. So let's talk about how to do that. I'm going to set that aside. I've got my extra piece of clay, and what I'm going to do with my extra piece of clay is roll it into a ball. And once you have your ball created, then what you're going to need to do is create the shape of the chameleon's head. So a chameleon's head is flat on one side. That's where we'll be attaching it to the body. So I'm just going to flatten it on my mat. And then the other side protrudes or comes out. So now I'm going to be pinching it. Notice that my hand is top and bottom, side to side, and that's just drawing the clay out. Now it has this nice long look. If you can't do that or don't get it right the first time, just keep trying. All you have to do is pound it on the mat, pinch the top with your thumb on top and your fingers at the bottom, then rotate your hand and do the sides. And I don't want it to get too long. His face is actually not very long, so that looks like a pretty good length. And I want my gecko's mouth to be, I'm sorry, not a gecko, a chameleon's mouth to be open. So I'm going to take my stick, and where it's protruding, I'm just going to put my stick in there slowly, slowly, and now it looks like he's chewing on my stick, and then I can take that out. Now where I put my stick that did create some rough lines, I'm going to go ahead and open his mouth a little bit more. And I'm just going to smooth out any of those lines, smoothing out any cracks of clay to make the entire surface look nice and smooth. Now, geckos, I keep saying that. Now, chameleons, making sure both sides look good. A sculpture has all the sides looking good. Chameleons have really large eyes. So to create those really large eyes, we're going to need some large pieces of clay on either side of the. So I've got my extra clay, and with my extra clay, I'm just going to create 2 pieces of clay that are about the size of an M&M. Go. There's one. I'm going to try to get them about the same size. That looks pretty good. And these are going to go on either side of the chameleon's head. So I'm going to flatten them just a little bit. It's always good to have a flat surface when you're attaching, and I'll flatten that just a little bit right there. Now, using something like a cap of a marker, I'm just going to press that in. There we go for his eye. He's got lots of lines around a chameleon's eye. There we go. Now I can go ahead and attach. Now you can make your chameleon look any way you want to. These are just suggestions that I'm sharing with you today. This is what I did to create mine, but you might have all sorts of different ideas. In fact, I know you will, so you give them a shot. If you want to have your chameleon wearing glasses, if you want to have your chameleon have a bow on its head, when you're finished with your chameleon, you can embellish and add all of those fun things. Okay, now that I've got both eyes attached, just to make sure they're really going to stay, I'm going to use that. I'm going to smooth out that line a little bit at the top, and that should be enough to hold it. Now, let's see how it's going to look on the body. That's going to look pretty good. I think the size looks good. It doesn't look too big. It's not going to topple forward. It doesn't look too small. So it's always good to check to make sure that's going to work. Now what I need to do is I want my chameleon to have a tongue sticking out. If you want to put a tiny little insect on the end of the tongue, you can. Just make sure that you toothbrush everything. I rolled a coil, much like I did for the body. I'm adding water to make sure there's no cracks, and I'm going to turn that into a spiral just like I did the body. Let's see how that looks. Pretty good. Make it a little shorter. Anything that sticks too far off of clay, there's a good chance it will snap and break. So you don't want the tongue to be sticking out too long. You want to make sure it's anchored to the body of the clay, the bigger pieces of the clay. Stuck my hand in his mouth to make sure it's nice and smooth. All right, he's looking pretty good. Now, chameleons do have nostrils, just like a snake, on either side of that part sticking out. And now I'm ready to attach. Now, when I attach, I'm going to think about where do I want him looking? Do I want him looking straight ahead? I kind of like mine looking in a different direction. This part needs to be flattened. So I'm just gently tapping it. There we go. All right, now that I know where I want to go, I'm just going to toothbrush. And make sure to do that trick like we did with the legs. Press and wiggle. You might end up misshaping the head a little bit. That's okay. You can always go back and fix it. Find a place where you can use your fingers to smear the 2 pieces of clay together. This is going to be very important. If you do not do this, the head of your chameleon could come off, which would be very sad to have a headless chameleon. So make sure you've got it nice and attached. Give it a wiggle test. Make sure it's going to stay. Now, last but not least, I'm going to do some more texture on the head. I'm also going to add pupils to the eyes. Okay, so the chameleon's all done, and now I'm ready to add it to the leaf that I created. So I'm going to get this leaf back out again, and you could leave your leaf flat, but I like my leaf to have a little bit of a curve to it. So I'm going to use some extra clay, might even have to get a bigger piece than this, and just put it underneath my leaf to kind of prop it up. No, I think that's perfect. It gives it a little bit of a lift, and find a good place for your gecko. I did it again. Find a good place for your chameleon to stand. And once you have a good place for him to stand, then go ahead and attach. Remember to toothbrush the bottom of the feet. Really good. He should be able to stand firmly. Spread his little feet out a little bit. Now, just because he sticks now doesn't mean he'll always stick. So make sure just gently. You don't want to ruin or misshapen his foot or change the lines on your leaf. Use your back of your fingernail or your fingertip to gently comb the feet. You should be able to lift your leaf up gently and make sure that it is attached. Now, it's going to need to dry completely. All the water will need to evaporate before it can be fired in the kiln. Then when it's fired in the kiln, when it's done, after about 2 weeks of drying and kiln fire, you'll get it back and be able to add some paint. All right, let's get started on your chameleon.